All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Dr. Paul Saladino. There's salad in Saladino.
I know there is. But there's also dino, which could be like dinosaur, or I think Mark Sisson figured this out. There's some grammatical gymnastics you can do with my last name. It can be salad, ? I, no.
No, without the K. Yeah. All right, cool.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk to you a bit about, what you're most famous for, of course, the whole cardio diet thing. But I don't want to spend the whole time talking about it because, so much of that's already out there. People can watch your lectures online and hear you talking about that everywhere. I was looking at your background. You're a psychiatrist, is that right?
So Western medicine might call me, quote, a psychiatrist. I hate the term.
Oh.
I did my residency. Yeah, I hate the term for so many reasons. I did my residency in psychiatry and then got board certified in nutrition. But when I was in medical school, so in case people don't know this, everybody that's an MD goes to the same medical school, takes the same boards, and then at the end of medical school, we're all kind of disillusioned and burnt out, and we decide what type of residency we want to do. And at that point, I got really interested in human story and mental illness and mood disorders and neuroinflammation. And so I went into psychiatry, and I don't think there would have been any residency that I would have been super excited about, but my focus and my perspective has always been broad. I like to think about how things are connected, and Western medicine likes to silo them. It's very balkanizing and saying, oh, you're a psychiatrist, you only deal with people who are depressed, or you're a cardiologist, you deal with the heart. But as we all know intuitively, everything is connected, right? There's a type of cardiomyopathy called Takotsubo, Takotsubo, cardiomyopathy, which causes apical dilatation of the heart when people have what's called broken heart. If they have a major emotional stressor, you can get a cardiomyopathy that causes dilatation of the heart. So I was a physician assistant in cardiology before I went back to medical school, but the point of this is just to say that I don't like medical specializations, and I think now I would just call myself a physician who's interested in understanding what causes illness at a root level and how to reverse it. But I did have formal training in mood disorders and psychotic disorders and neurobiology originally.
Well, psychiatry is a good choice for someone who's interested in a holistic understanding of health, I think. I mean, of course, by the way, I lived with a psychiatrist for 20 years. So I've sort of spent a lot of time in that world. And she's like you in the sense that she is not interested in giving people pills to cover up their problems. She's interested in sources and, psychodynamic, family structure, nutrition. And one of her great frustrations in life is that there really isn't a way to offer a holistic consultation to people. She would have people come into her office and say, well, of course they're upset. They don't sleep well. They don't eat well. Their family, their relationship sucks. They're probably, have toxic off-gassing in their apartment. Their work environment is horrible. Like, what can I do? It's like you can't break people down into these little fractal units and expect to treat them. But I was also interested, you did your, was it med school or I'm sorry, I looked at this last night and then I fell asleep and forgot most of it. But you were at University of Arizona in the complementary medicine program with Andrew Weil. Is that where you were? Or New Mexico?
That's right. That's where, it's in Tucson, Arizona. That's where I went to medical school. So yeah, prior to that, I was working as a physician assistant in cardiology, and I just quickly realized, man, the system is messed up. it's pharmaceutical based and
Yeah.
symptom focused, and I want to be a part of changing it. So that seemed like a good medical school, and yeah, it was fun. I got to talk to Andy Weil a few times, and there was, at least probably more than many medical schools, a focus on an integrative perspective on health. I kind of had to do my own sort of wandering down paths after that, but that was where I went to medical school. Yeah.
Yeah, Andy Weil's an old friend of mine. I met him in like 92, 93 or something, and we've been pals ever since. He's an interesting dude. I don't think he would agree with you on the carnivorous diet, though, would he? He's more of a Mediterranean guy.
Yeah, I would love to have a friendly debate and discussion with him about it, but I think we would see differently about that.
Yeah.
See differently. Yeah, there.
So let's go into that a little bit. What's the origin of this? Are you looking at it primarily from a personal experience perspective, or is it more sort of like an evolutionary argument, or what got you into it? Where did it start for you personally?
For me, it started with a personal story of asthma and eczema, but I've been interested in anthropology for years. In medical school, I was reading Wade Davis and reading about Andy Weil doing DMT and ayahuasca and stuff with these tribes, and so many good books, Mark Plotkin, and people who were living with indigenous cultures and cultures that are sort of removed from our society, which is what you and I talked about on my podcast with regard to your book, Civilized to Death. So that type of alternate living has always been fascinating to me, and those accounts have been really interesting. And so it's kind of been this merge, this coalescence of an evolutionary anthropology perspective, medical training, biochemistry, nutrition, and it was sparked by my own issues. So I had eczema and asthma growing up my whole life. It was never horrible, but it got worse and worse and worse, to the point that when I was in medical school and I got into grappling, like jiu-jitsu, it got really bad. It was on my elbows and knees, and it would get infected from the mats. And then it got so bad that I got septic once or twice when it got very infected. And so it was a pretty severe thing. And toward the end of medical school, it was bad. And at that point, I was eating what many people in the paleo quote community would consider to be a healthy diet: grass-fed meat, salads, avocado, olive oil, things like this. And yet my eczema was persistent. And it didn't really click until I got to residency, which I did at the University of Washington in Seattle, that something was still off. That something I'm eating is still triggering my eczema. And eczema, as your listeners will probably know, is an autoimmune condition. As I went on in medicine, I got more and more interested in these autoimmune conditions because they are everything. And that's a bit of hyperbole, but not as much as it may sound. Psychiatric illness is very often autoimmune. There is an immunologic activation crossing the blood-brain barrier with cytokines causing neural inflammation, right? This is the immune system reacting against the body. Arthritis, psoriasis, eczema, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, Sjogren's, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. These are all autoimmune conditions. Ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, so much of what we think of. Even atherosclerosis involves the immune system and could be thought of as an autoimmune condition in so many ways. And so this idea of why is our immune system so confused in people was pervasive. And I just kept thinking it must be food in some people. Surely there are toxins or other exposures that can trigger the immune system, heavy metals. But so much, I think, of what we see with immune system is just antigens moving across the gut and triggering the immune system, and we can go down that rabbit hole. So I was thinking, okay, I have an immune problem. I have eczema. I can live with it. I can put creams on it. I could take an oral steroid, but I don't want to do that. I want to correct the root cause. So here I am in my second or third year of residency, eating a paleo diet, thinking, why do I still have eczema? What in my diet is triggering this? And it was at that point that I started to think about plants and meat and kind of start to think about the evolutionary perspective. And then I heard a podcast with Jordan Peterson on Rogan, and he was saying that he had an autoimmune disease and he had what sounded like sleep apnea, and he cut out all the plants in his diet and they got better rapidly. And I thought, that's crazy. Like, we must have plants in the human diet. We know, quote unquote, that plants are super nutritious for humans, and I'd sort of been steeped in this functional medicine ideology that fiber is good and these phytonutrients are valuable for humans. But there was this cognitive dissonance suddenly, and I kind of like those positions. So I said, heck, I'm going to throw out all the plants in my diet and see what happens. I like experimenting with the way that I'm eating. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, I felt great with an all animal food diet. And we can talk about what that was: animal meat, animal organs, animal fat. And my eczema had resolved. And I thought, okay, there's something to this. Maybe not all the plants I was eating were triggering my immune system, but some of the plants that were widely considered to be healthy were clearly triggering my immune system. And the exclusion of those resolved the immunologic activation. And at least within the first month, I knew, hey, I didn't spontaneously combust. I didn't have gastric distress. I didn't have constipation.
You didn't have
my intestines didn't explode.
No? I've been reading about explosive diarrhea in the first 2 weeks anyway. That didn't happen.
Oh, well, I did have diarrhea. And we can talk about that. But I did not have fecal impaction, to say that you do not necessarily, it challenged the notion that we absolutely need fiber to poop easily and pleasantly. But yeah, and I thought, well, this is cool. Like, I'm just eating animal foods and I feel pretty good. I'm going to keep doing this, and I'm going to think about it, because maybe this is a key for a lot of people that's being ignored. You go to a doctor in Western medicine and say you have eczema or psoriasis or vitiligo or any skin condition or autoimmune condition, which is going to span the range of medical specialties, as we know, because it's so balkanized. And chances are very high that none of those physicians is going to suggest dietary change to you. None of those physicians is going to say, Chris, maybe your psoriasis is related to your diet. Do you want to consider an elimination diet? Because, in fact, the reverse is often true. Physicians poo-poo these ideas of dietary change, even in conditions that are gastroenterological, like inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome. It's great. It's in the gut. And gastroenterologists still do not like to accept that it could be related to your food on an autoimmune basis. So I thought, this is really important that I think about this, and that I do more research, and that I really look into this idea of plants and their relative value for humans, which is certainly individual, and animal foods and their relative value for humans. And if there's something here, I want to do more work. And that was the beginning of my sort of deep rabbit hole down which I tumbled. I definitely took the red pill and got very interested in a carnivore diet and similarly an animal-based diet, and I can talk about the differences between those. And here I am almost 3 years later, no eczema, feeling really good, surfing every day, tan in Costa Rica, and thinking, this is really cool. I want people to know that this is an option if they are not healthy, if they are not in a place of health and they're not getting answers from their physician, and they're being they're feeling like they're trapped, and they're thinking, the only thing I have left is X, Y, or Z medication for this. I want to be the person that says, hey, number one, animal foods are incorrectly vilified. This sort of mainstream demonization of animal foods is bullshit and is based on observational science, which doesn't really represent evolutionary precedent or human physiology. Number two, not all plants are totally benign for humans, and they exist on a spectrum. And if you take both of those things into account, I think a lot of people who are suffering can find relief and incredible health, and that's a really meaningful thing for me.
Right. Yeah, I hear you on that. And I appreciate the fact that you said that these things are very individualistic as well. That you're not saying that everyone's going to get better from every disease by following this diet. It could work really well for some people, and for other people, like every other potential treatment, you try it, and if it doesn't work, you move on to something else. I'm putting words in your mouth there, but I assume that's what you meant.
Yes, definitely. It's very individual. Yeah, it's very individual. I've heard now hundreds, if not thousands, of anecdotes, admittedly, but incredible improvements in people. So I think that for a lot of people, it's very helpful. And there are some people, either their genetics don't align or they have pre-existing conditions and it's not going to be good for them. But I think it is a powerful tool, and it challenges a mainstream paradigm that I think needs to be examined more deeply.
Right. So let's look at some of the sort of primary objections to this that people could have. First of all, the absence of fiber in the diet. Is it not the case that our microbiome needs fiber to eat and function properly? And if there's not enough fiber, that the microbes begin to eat the mycin layer of the intestines, and we end up with digestive problems that way?
So this is an often parroted concept that is totally false. So this is not true. And I believe it's based on one mouse study in the journal Cell from 2016. And it's not something that is borne out in humans experimentally or clinically at all. What's fascinating about our microbiome is that it actually is quite malleable. Just like we are omnivores as humans and have always been able to eat either animal foods or plant foods, and we can get in later in the podcast into a lot of interesting anthropologic evidence suggesting that we are primarily adapted to eat the majority of our diet as animal foods. Even most omnivores are specialized one direction or the other. But our gut microbiome is flexible. It can go either direction. And we have only to think about the frequency with which our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have fasted to realize that fiber could not be necessary for a healthy gut microbiome. There are fascinating changes in the gut microbiome that happen with fasting. Even intermittent fasting of 16 hours or 14 hours changes populations of Bacteroides fragilis and Akkermansia in the gut in a positive way. They've done studies in Ramadan looking at Akkermansia populations and how they increase. Now, Akkermansia is a gut microbe that needs mucin to live. And fasting is basically the ultimate zero fiber diet. There is no fiber. So we do not see that humans develop inflammatory bowel disease when they fast. And the longest fast ever recorded medically for a human is 382 days.
What?
And a gentleman named Angus Bowery, I think was his last name. So he was massively obese and then lost over 200 pounds on a 382-day medically supervised fast. And what they clearly know from this is that he did not develop inflammatory bowel disease. His intestines did not rot out from the inside, but the human gut microbiome can shift. And in fact, there's a lot of interesting papers now talking about either ketogenic physiology and the appearance of ketones like beta-hydroxybutyrate in the bloodstream, which can substitute for the short-chain fatty acids, which are generally butyrate, right? So beta-hydroxybutyrate and butyrate are very similar molecules. People often say fiber or fermentable plant fiber is used by the gut bugs, quote unquote, to make short-chain fatty acids, which is then used by the colonic epithelial cells for their energy. But we can use multiple short-chain fatty acids to do this, some of which can be made from protein or fat, things like isobutyric acid, propionic acid. All sorts of short-chain fatty acids can substitute for butyric acid and actually have been shown to activate the same receptors in the gut. So it's a much more broad, sort of perhaps ecumenical perspective in the gut than people make it out to be. It's not just that Christianity is not the only game in town, right? There's like, you can do, and I'm obviously making a metaphor there, but you can take periods with low fiber, or some people can tolerate more fiber. But if you actually talk to physicians like myself or other physicians in the GI world who work with people, I've talked to numerous colleagues who say that for a lot of people with inflamed guts, more fiber actually makes them worse. And the removal of fiber can be very healing for people. So we have this incredible microbiome that can shift, that can use protein or fat, especially collagen proteins, so these collagen polymers, and ferment those into short-chain fatty acids. If we are ketosis-based or we're ketogenic, we can use blood-derived beta-hydroxybutyrate. But regardless, there's a lot of malleability in the gut. One of my good friends, Tommy Wood, who I've had on the podcast, just sent me an email the other day saying he's publishing a paper. He sent me the paper, but I can't show it because it's not actually in print yet, and he would kill me. But the title of the paper is is about the malleability of the gut. So this paper should be published very soon, but the title of the paper is Reframing Nutritional Microbiota Studies to Reflect an Inherent Metabolic Flexibility of the Human Gut, a narrative review focusing on high-fat diets. It's going to be published, I think, in MBio or a journal. Anyway, if it gets published soon, I can send you the link when this comes out, and I can show you guys this paper. But it's pretty cool stuff to think that the human gut microbiome is very malleable.
Yeah.
We definitely do not need fiber. And I think that the overarching thing is, hey, if you're eating a lot of fiber and you don't have a problem with it, fine. But if you are getting gas, bloating, constipation can even be caused by fiber. There's a really interesting interventional study from 2012 from the World Journal of Gastroenterology where they took people with idiopathic constipation, meaning the doctors don't know what's causing it. In medical school, we used to joke that acronym meant that the doctor was an idiot when you say idiopathic. But anyway, idiopathic constipation, right? They put them into fiber as usual, moderate fiber, reduced fiber, and zero fiber. And the zero fiber group completely resolved their constipation. Each cohort was only 20 or so people. But of the 20 who had zero fiber, who had idiopathic constipation prior, all 20 completely resolved their constipation. And so it's studies like this that show us, hey, number one, constipation is not a lack of fiber. Number two, you don't need fiber to poop. And number three, not all fiber is created equally. And number four, your gut microbiome will be just fine without fiber. It will not digest the mucus layer. There's plenty of good studies in humans and animal models now showing that mucus layer persists even in a ketogenic state. So it's a great question, though, because it's so commonly thought that way.
What about correlations between low fiber and rectal cancer or colon cancer, diverticulosis, that sort of thing? I mean, I've got a mechanical mental paradigm of the gut where the fiber just sort of keeps things moving along. And I'm imagining without fiber, you get these little pockets of rotting, fermenting nastiness that just sit there. Is that not accurate?
That's not how it works. And actually, there's more than one, Chris. There's at least 2 or 3 colonoscopy series trials. They're observational, but in those trials, they actually correlate fiber intake with higher rates of diverticulosis. So just so people know what we're talking about here, diverticulosis is these little mini appendices that happen generally in the transverse or descending colon. They can happen in the right side of the colon as well, but they're outpouchings of the mucosal layer through the muscularis layer of the colon. And originally, I think thanks to the work of Dennis Burkitt, who was wrong, diverticulosis was felt to be due to a lack of fiber in the human diet. But again, the key word that you used there originally is correlation, right? So though these may be correlated, they have not been linked causally. And in fact, there are many studies like this. These 3 papers I can think of with probably over 6,000 people where they would do colonoscopies and look to see how much diverticulosis and then ask them how much fiber they're eating. And by quartile, as you go up in fiber, you get more diverticulosis. So that would be a correlation in the other direction, more fiber, more diverticulosis. Now, I think the most compelling explanation for diverticulosis is back to what I mentioned originally, which is autoimmune. There's actually lymphocytic infiltration in the mucosal layer of the colon in people with diverticulosis, weakening the muscular layer. So I think we're back to an autoimmune thing, which wouldn't be surprising, rather than an actual pressure thing. In Asians especially, there's a lot of right-sided diverticulosis, which is right at the cecum, and that's the ileocecal valve. And that's a very low pressure area. So right-sided diverticulosis really in and of itself is a strong argument against any sort of pressure phenomenon in the gut causing these diverticuli. The rectal cancer, the colon cancer thing is also fascinating. So though there may be a correlation between low fiber diets and colon cancer or rectal cancer, there were 3 landmark studies in 1999, 2000, 2 of them in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they gave people more fiber. These are actual 4 to 8 year interventional studies. They gave people more fiber. This is not an observational epidemiology study. And in one study, they gave them more fruits and vegetables. In another study, they gave them a fiber supplement. And then in a third study, they did both, and they extended it from 4 to 8 years. And in every single one of those studies, there was no difference in the recurrence of colon adenocarcinoma or adenomas. So either precancerous lesions or cancer lesions. So we have to kind of go back. This is a really important point to make. Something like over 75% of the correlations that are shown in observational studies are disproven when interventional studies are done because there are so many variables. So we go back and we say, okay, the interventional studies clearly show fiber does not prevent colon cancer. That's incontrovertible. There's no improvement in the outcome when fiber is given with colon cancer. But when you look at the correlation, you have to ask, is it possible that when people are eating a low fiber diet, they're doing other things that are associated with that increase the risk of cancer? And that's probably what's happening. In fact, that's almost certainly what's happening. You can imagine that someone, if they're eating a low fiber diet, is maybe not a health conscious individual, and maybe they're not exercising, maybe they're not getting in the sun, maybe they're not doing other things that are important for their overall health as a human. And those are probably contributing to colon cancer more than a lack of fiber, because that doesn't seem to be an issue at all. Does that make sense?
It does, but it's ironic, right? Because when you're saying if people are eating a low fiber diet, they probably are, there are other aspects of their life that are not healthy. But that's all based upon a false paradigm as far, from your perspective, the high fiber equating to healthy lifestyle, right? So, it reminds me of the 70s when my mother bought us margarine and convinced us not to eat butter because margarine was the healthy alternative, right? And then later we look back and say, that was a bunch of fucking bullshit. We were eating industrial, rancid garbage. And it was being sold to us as the healthy lifestyle. To my father's credit, my father said bullshit. So on the table every night there was the plastic margarine bin and my father's stick of butter, and he stuck to his guns. It was great.
Yeah, I love it. And probably in this podcast we'll talk about seed oils, but margarine is partially hydrogenated seed oil, and I think that seed oils creeping into the human diet are one of the most insidious and damaging things that have happened to us over the last 100 years, let alone the last 10,000 years of agriculture. Probably there were seed oils as far back as Egypt, and if you look at the health of Egyptians, it was pretty abysmal, especially at the higher upper classes. But yeah, I think that there is it's a totally false paradigm here. But when you think about it, what is the narrative since the 1950s and 1960s in this country, the time of Ansel Keys and the 7 countries study? Saturated fat is bad. This is why margarine came along. Animal foods are bad for you. How are you healthy? Low fat, fruit and vegetables, right? So this creates, at least in the West, in the US and westernized countries, it creates an association between people who eat that way, who might eat more fruits and vegetables, are also the people who are health conscious, which means, Beaver Cleaver is going to be the guy who's like eating his fruits and vegetables and also going to play tennis with his friends or playing golf and getting in the sun and getting his colonoscopy every few years. And so it's no surprise that these observational studies show a correlation between fruit and vegetable consumption, at least in the West, but not in the East, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and improved outcomes. But is it the fruit and vegetables, or is it the other things that people are doing because they're the goody two-shoes, right? They're the people who adhere to health advice. And the crazy thing here, and this is something I talk about all the time, and it's important for people to understand, is that in medical research, the opposite is also true. There is a James Dean, right? There is a live fast, die young guy who says, I don't care what you tell me, I'm gonna eat my hamburger because it tastes freaking good. And it probably tastes good because we have an evolutionary precedent to know that meat tastes good. But that person is also the guy that smokes cigarettes, drinks alcohol, rides a motorcycle, isn't gonna get a colonoscope up his butt ever, and isn't gonna have any sort of health screening. And so it's no wonder that meat correlates in the West with worse outcomes.
Right.
Well, because those are the rebels, right? They're following the paradigm. And the reason we can tell this, or at least the reason we start to suspect this very strongly, that these correlations are not accurate, that we cannot draw causative inference, and that there's something funny going on beneath the surface, is that if you look in Asia, There have been studies of over 200, 300,000 people across multiple Asian countries. The correlations are completely different. We're still dealing with Homo sapiens, right? But the correlations are completely different. In Asia, the men who eat the most meat have the lowest rates of heart disease, and the women who eat the most meat have the lowest rates of cancer. So is meat good for Asians? And this is red meat. This is red meat. Is meat good for Asians and bad for Americans? No. It's that the narrative is different. That in Asia, meat is affluence. And in the US, meat is rebellion. And so that's what's so misleading about these correlational studies and these observational studies that we hear about over and over and over. And if you think about it evolutionarily, it makes complete sense. Why would something that's been at the center of our progress as humans, and I know you love that word progress, the center of our evolution as humans, the growth of these brains, and we can talk about the anthropology side of this now if you want, but why would something that's been at the very center of who we are as humans? In my book, The Carnivore Code, I contend that eating meat made us human, that it made us human by providing more nutrients, more calories, special vitamins and minerals that we weren't getting in plant foods. Why would that be bad for us? It doesn't make any sense. And why would we have deep brain neural networks that we can see when we study this that unanimously respond positively to meat? There's this amazing study that I talk about in the book and that I've talked about in the past where they actually put EEG leads on somebody's head, so electroencephalography leads on somebody's head, and you can see the brain lighting up in different regions. And they show vegetarians and omnivores pictures of steaks. And at the cognitive level, in the neocortex, like the conscious level, vegetarians have an aversion to meat. At the cognitive conscious level, omnivores see the steak and they go, that's delicious. But in both a vegetarian's brain and an omnivore's brain, at the more ancestral levels, there is a positive response to meat. In the paper, they say the motivational salience of meat is preserved across all humans. So we know deep down in the lizard brain, right, that wants to fight and have sex and eat, that meat is good for us. It responds positively, even in people who have this conscious aversion due to whatever reason they're choosing not to eat it. So, you know, you get it.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
It's all connected, but it's all very complicated too, right? Because you're talking about the lizard brain responding to meat. But when we say the word meat, we're talking about so many different things, right? We're talking about Joe Rogan's elk that he went out and shot and, flew home on the private jet and, had butchered by some, $1 million butcher somewhere. And we're also talking about industrially raised, grain-fed cows living in their own shit, full of growth hormones and antibiotics, right? So it becomes very complicated to say meat is good when meat generally, for most people, refers more to the diseased, barely alive cow than it does to the elk roaming in Montana.
This is a fantastic point and something I've become very passionate about. I think that one of the key things about what I do is helping educate people that there are other options, that there's a growing trend of regenerative agriculture, and there's a growing trend of farms that actually mimic the ecosystem of animals. They're grass feeding and grass finishing cattle, but they're also doing rotational grazing. And you can look at these farms like White Oak Pastures in Georgia or Belcampo in Northern California, or there's so many of them now, they're growing, thankfully. And they've done life cycle analyses, and you can look at the amount of carbon in the soil, which is carbon being sequestered from the environment into the soil, fixed into the root network of plants by mycorrhizal networks in the bacteria. It's the soil microbiome. You can see that changing over time when you actually feed animals properly, when you do rotational grazing. There's a great farm in Texas called Rome Ranch, and they have bison. And you can imagine this is the way that bison have lived in North America for hundreds of millions of years, or millions of years at least. I don't know how many hundreds of millions of years bison have been around. But they eat the grass down to maybe, they give the grass like a buzz cut, but they don't make it bald. They don't eat the roots, and then they move around. They move to another part of the pasture or to a new field. And while they're eating the grass, they're peeing and pooping, so they're depositing all the nutrients, and they're depositing microbes and nitrogen, naturally depositing nitrogen back into the soil, and it's a cycle. And what happens is the grass gets stronger and stronger, and the soil gets richer and richer in carbon. And if you look at the dirt in the Dakotas where it hasn't been farmed, it's like chocolate. And you look at the dirt at Will Harris's farm in Bluffton, Georgia, it's like coffee grounds. And then you look at the dirt from his neighbor's farm with cotton 150 meters away, and it looks like really weak chocolate milk. So it's just a completely different thing. You can see the carbon in the soil, and you can take measurements, and you can see the carbon go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5%. And for every percent of carbon that's in the soil, that soil can hold an inch of rain. Another inch of rain in a flood event, which means that you could get 5 inches of rain on Will Harris's pasture, and it's going to go into the soil and just be held there, right? And it's not going to run off. It's not going to take the topsoil into an estuary and kill a river. But in his neighbor's pasture, which is 0.5%, they can only get half an inch of rain before the topsoil erodes. So this is the type of agriculture that is happening now, and it's supportable, it's doable, and it's scalable. And that carbon is coming from the environment. So I referred to a life cycle analysis. Regenerative agriculture is carbon negative, meaning they sequester more carbon into the soil than is actually produced by the cow burping, which is the way it's always been. There were 150 million ruminants, deer, bison, elk, antelope, pronghorn, in North America in 1850. And they were not raising the carbon parts per million levels in the atmosphere. They were not polluting the planet with their, cow farts. They were grazing and sequestering carbon as part of the carbon cycle. And then Europeans came in and we did monocrop agriculture. When you till the field, the carbon is destroyed, the mycorrhizal networks are destroyed. And Rome Ranch is a rehabilitation ranch where they're taking soil that was absolutely destroyed by monocrop agriculture in Texas and regenerating it. And how do you regenerate soil? With animals. So rather than looking toward plant-based meat for the future of our planet, we should be looking toward supporting regenerative agriculture, because that's the way you regenerate animals. Elon Musk was recently on Joe's podcast, and he said he's offering $100 million or $10 million, I forget how much. It's all big numbers to me, for a technology that would sequester carbon. And I texted Joe. I never got a response, but I texted Joe because we talked sometime after I was on his podcast, and I said, "Does Elon know about regenerative agriculture? Because it already exists." And the problem is that Bill Gates is the biggest owner of farmland in the United States, and Bill Gates doesn't want to have animals on his land. So if Elon Musk is really serious about carbon sequestration, he would buy all the farmland in the U.S. and become the next Ted Turner and raise bison and cows properly. And so the next question that people have is it scalable? And it's absolutely scalable. We could raise all of the cattle in the United States, grass-fed, grass-finished, and there would be enough meat for all of us. It's totally scalable. There's something like, I don't know if it's 300,000, I don't know the number off the top of my head. There are hundreds of thousands of acres in the United States as part of the Conservation Reserve Program. The federal government is paying farmers to leave them barren, to rehabilitate them, to leave them fallow, because the fields are so destroyed. And we could be paying farmers to raise cattle on that land. There's plenty of land, right? And if we stop grain finishing our cattle, we can get rid of all this corn. We don't need to grow this corn, right? So the system will work. Elon, if you're listening to this, right? Regenerative agriculture is...
Elon, if you're listening to this, come on my show.
Doubtful.
I'll get you on.
Right? But you get the idea, right? I love that you're
agree.
making this distinction that it's so important to know that not all meat is the same. And I'm not supporting factory farming.
Right.
Yeah.
So
there's another way.
I mean, what do you say to people who say, okay, Paul, that all makes sense. That's all great. But this is a lot of upper class white privilege here, because most people don't have access to regenerative, locally raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, not to mention pigs. I can't find any kind of humanely raised pork other than a local farm, where I just take the word of the farmer. But in a grocery store, I can't even find it. And I like bacon, so it kind of bums me out. But what do you say that this is? I mean, I can anticipate your answer, but I want to let you give it. When people say, hey, come on, where I live, we can't even get organic vegetables, much less, or I can't afford the kind of meat you're talking about.
So those are two different things, but this is why the rise of e-commerce with farms like White Oak, Belcampo, Circle C Farms is really cool. They will ship meat to your house, right?
Right.
So the internet is an amazing thing, and in North America, there's really not many places where you could not get meat from one of these farms delivered to your door. The financial question is a little bit more sticky, and to that, I usually ask people, what is it worth to you, right? It gets a little delicate. It's like, what do you spend your money on? What is it worth to you? Do you have a cell phone? Do you have a cable bill? What's your car payment? And none of that is really my business. But what's your priority? Is your priority health? Is your priority the persistence of our ecosystem on the planet Earth so that your children can have a place to live? Or would you rather save $4 a pound by getting a ribeye at Costco, which is clearly supporting factory farming agriculture? So it's just, I think people kind of want their cake and they want to eat it too, and they need to take responsibility and say, okay, the reality, Paul and Chris, is this just isn't my priority. I'd rather spend money on Netflix, or I'd rather spend money on my cell phone. And I'm not saying that's what people are thinking, but that often occurs. I mean, I've done the math, and we've talked about this on my social media and the social media for my company, which is called Heart and Soil. And you can eat an animal-based diet composed of really well-raised meat and organs for around $15 a day. Now, some people may not have $15 a day to spend on their food, but I also would challenge listeners to say, if you can't budget $15 a day for your food, what is more important than your health as a human? Is there some redistribution of priorities in line there? We just need to be aware of the very striking reality that the quality of the food you eat will affect the quality of your life, and it's not just about calories for you as a human. The other piece of this equation that we haven't really touched on that I just want to mention is the importance of organs. So we've talked about, quote, meat, but how many people eat liver? Yeah. Right? Well, liver is $4 a pound. $4 or $5 a pound for grass-fed, grass-finished liver. Offal, OFFAL, organ meats are very cheap. Sometimes you'll go to a butcher and they will throw it at you across the counter. They'll say, take this away for free. I don't want this kidney. Here's some fat, have some suet. And that stuff is really nutritious and would have been prized by our ancestors massively, right?
Much more than the meat.
They were hunting fat. They were hunting organs. When I was with the Hadza in Tanzania this February, they always ate the organs first, and they're always eating nose to tail. They're eating the whole animal. So you don't just have to eat ribeyes. If somebody wants to do this and they want to have a diet that's composed of more well-raised animal products, you don't have to have a filet mignon for every meal. You don't have to have a ribeye for every meal. You can get $5 per pound grass-fed ground beef, and unless you're eating 3 pounds of that a day, I'm pretty sure you can get below $15 a day for your meat and whatever other things you want to eat in a day. But incorporate into that some of the nutrient-rich organs, like get some liver in your diet. Most butchers will throw it at you, or it'll be $5 a pound or $6 a pound, and an ounce or two of liver per day provides us with very unique nutrients. Now, I can anticipate that a lot of people are going to say, I will never eat liver, that's gross. And that is why I built a company that makes desiccated organ supplements. So there's a plug for us at Heart and Soil. If you guys need more organs, check it out at heartandsoil.co. But get organs in your diet somehow, whether it's fresh or desiccated in a pill like we make. But I think that they're powerful and they allow your money to go further with this. And it's also kind of respectful, right? Like, don't just eat the backstrap. Like, you would never kill an elk on the plains and just cut off the backstrap and then leave the whole thing to rot. Other animals would probably eat it, like a puma or a bobcat or a mountain lion, but we would just never do that as humans. Like, it's respectful and nutritionally complete to eat all of the organs in your diet.
Yeah, it's interesting how much of this is driven by emotion. Like you were talking about Bill Gates earlier. I don't know if he's a vegetarian or what his deal is personally, but I get emails constantly, having written a couple of books about prehistoric life. I get emails constantly from vegetarians and vegans saying, I'm surprised you don't understand that our ancestors were herbivores. And and without fail, I respond to them like, look, the evidence from our digestive system, from the chemistry of our saliva, from our dentition, there's so much evidence that we're omnivores, right? That every hunter-gatherer group that's ever been studied is omnivorous, but they're absolutely incapable of hearing any of that. They're so convinced it's a religious argument, basically, right? It's faith-based. How do you... Well, let me phrase this another way. Is there any evidence that could come to light that would make you reevaluate your perspective on this?
Well, I would like to believe that I'm open-minded enough that if evidence came to light that was convincing, that I would reevaluate my perspective. However, there is so much evidence, including the paper that you just sent me that I was looking at from my friend Miki Ben-Dor, who's an anthropologist and is looking at human trophic level in the Pleistocene era and the Middle and Late Paleolithic. And, there's stable isotope studies, there's the acidity of our stomach, there's the fact that our large intestine is 70% smaller than a baboon's or a chimpanzee's, and there's so much evidence. And in fact, most monkeys are omnivorous. They're not herbivorous. Most monkeys eat the majority of their food as plants, but will eat other monkeys and will eat meat when it arrives.
Sure.
Earlier in the podcast, I suggested this notion that I think when people hear omnivore, they imagine that all omnivores just eat a broad mix and a balance of foods, and that all omnivores out there they eat the same amount of everything. They eat 50% plant foods and 50% animal foods. Nothing could be further from the truth. Omnivores are generally specialized, with over 70% of omnivores either going animal heavy or plant heavy. And you can look at a dog, which is pretty similar to our digestive system. A dog is probably one of the closer ones, also in terms of biochemistry. And they're descended from a wolf. Like, they're mostly carnivorous. They're eating 70+% of their diet as animal foods. And then you can look at a monkey, and they're the other side. They're also an omnivore, but they're eating 70+% of their diet as plant foods. Now, we are descended from monkeys, but we are massively different in terms of our biochemistry, the pH of our stomach, the actual structure of our jaw, the size of our small and large intestines, the size of our brain relative to our body. We do a lot of energy-intensive things as Homo sapiens and previously Homo erectus and Homo habilis that point toward meat consumption. And there's all sorts of paleoanthropology evidence there as well. So it would be very hard to convince me otherwise, but I like to think I would be open to it. But This brings up an important point, that as I've gone through this evolution over the last 3 years, my position is not so much that I hope that everyone will eat a diet of entirely meat. I kind of hinted at this in the beginning, but I'll just make sure that I've really elaborated on it. I want people to understand a few key concepts, and they are that meat and organs are the center of the human diet. They made us human. They're the most nutritious foods on the planet, and they should not be incorrectly demonized or vilified based on bad science. And they should be, I believe, as omnivores, we are carnivorous omnivores, right? That the majority of our diet should be animal foods. And then the rest of our diet, be it 20 or 30% or whatever the fraction is, may be plant foods. But those plant foods exist on a toxicity spectrum, and if you are not thriving, if you have a medical issue, you should understand there are more and less toxic plants in there. And if you eliminate the most toxic plants, or you do a period with no plants and then gradually reintroduce the least toxic plants, I think a lot of people will thrive. And of course, overlying, the whole thing is framed in this idea that absolutely, hopefully everyone understands this, that you should definitely not be eating processed sugar, and you should definitely eliminate seed oils, corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, peanut, grapeseed, soybean from your life, because those things we've never seen them evolutionarily, and they appear to cause havoc mitochondrially and other ways. So in the beginning, I think that I was more gung-ho about carnivore, all meat, and now I kind of talk about this animal-based diet. I think that, like I said, as omnivores, the more animal-based we eat, the better we do, but people are afraid of that because of the fiber and all this rhetoric that's been, sort of put out there about meat incorrectly. So hopefully that kind of clarifies my position.
What are some of the more toxic vegetables that you think people should avoid?
Yeah, good question. So I like to kind of take mushrooms and think about this like a plant. Like I'm just, like.
So mushrooms are not toxic.
I've only taken mushrooms twice. Well, they're medicine, but not food, maybe, in my opinion. So when I've done mushrooms twice, and it was really cool. I did heroic doses both times and did a lot of work. But one of the cool things was that I felt like I could talk to plants, which was amazing. And plants had much more life, and they were clearly alive, and there was a being there that I could interact. It was like a door open and then closed.
Yeah.
But you can imagine whether you've taken mushrooms or not. Think about this from the perspective of a plant. A plant is rooted in the ground, and it's got a stem and leaves and fruit and seeds in those leaves. So I think that if we start from the top, the most toxic part of a plant is the part of a plant that it doesn't want you to eat the most, which would be the seed, because we don't want our kids to get hurt. Plants don't want their babies to get eaten. They really want those babies to move out into the earth, into the environment, and spread their DNA. So if you look at plant seeds, they are very strongly defended with digestive enzyme inhibitors, phytic acid, which is a chelating compound that'll hold on to minerals, oxalates, lectins, these carbohydrate binding proteins that appear to cause problems in the gut. So plant seeds are very highly defended. And though we don't think of them this way, grains, nuts, seeds, and beans are all plant seeds. If you plant them in the ground, they will grow a new plant. They're all plant seeds.
But I thought...
So I think that
I thought that the purpose of fruit was to encourage animals to eat and distribute the seeds in their shit.
Exactly, but the plant doesn't want you to actually bite through the seed and chew it up, because a chewed up seed has had all of the endosperm and everything disrupted. It's not going to grow into a new plant,
so
right?
you can swallow the seed as long as you don't digest it or chew it.
Exactly. So the apple is a great example. We've all been told, don't eat the apple seed, it's poisonous. And it isn't a little bit. It has cyanogenic glycosides like laetrile in an apple seed. And so the idea is, if you're going to eat that as an animal, you're going to eat that, but you're not going to bite the seed because the seeds are bitter. And you can think about peaches and plums. They have that stone fruit, right? They have that seed inside. Some of them put a carapace on it. They put a real protective covering on the seed. And then some fruit have taken a different perspective. They have so many seeds, like a blueberry or a strawberry, that they just figure that the numbers will, work, and that some of the seeds will get crunched and some of them will make it through. But the single seed plants, grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes, they're not for human consumption. I mean, raw beans are frankly toxic to humans. We have to cook the crap out of them and pressure cook them to even make them digestible. And even doing that, you're probably not going to remove all the lectins and stuff in them. So I think those make very poor food for humans. Maybe we would have eaten them evolutionarily in a survival situation, but those are not optimal food. And there are examples of hunter-gatherers eating nuts, but generally that's an exception to the rule. The Kung San have the magongo nut, but generally they don't eat a lot of grains, they don't eat a lot of seeds, they don't eat a lot of beans. It depends, right? So there's a spectrum within that. But I would say that for a lot of people, getting rid of nuts, because there's no magongo nuts in the US that I'm aware of, getting rid of nuts like almonds improves so many people's digestion. They're just so hard to digest for a lot of people. Yeah, it's amazing. And then we can go down, there's more levels to the toxicity, but seeds are at the top.
It's interesting. It's $1 million idea there. Let's import Mongo nuts. Mongongo
nuts. Yeah, we could.
There's so many. You're talking about the sort of misinformation or disinformation around meat. I imagine one aspect of it that we haven't touched on is that, we did touch on the growth hormones and the unsanitary conditions and the antibiotics and all that stuff. But until relatively recently, the last 50, 60 years, there really wasn't any guarantee that you weren't going to get sick and die from meat, right? Because even now the FDA is understaffed in terms of inspections and so on. I imagine there's a stigma, sort of a lasting historical stigma that meat until recently was a kind of a high risk food.
I'd have to look further at the actual history of that. At least now, if you look at the data in the last 20 or 30 years, there's more foodborne illness from plants than there is from meat. Like spinach in the bag, and just the way we transport these things. So there's quite a bit of foodborne illness on plants as well as meat, and you can imagine that meat raised well is going to be much less problematic. Ultimately, fresh meat is pretty darn safe for humans. You can even eat it raw, and there's really compelling hypotheses that the acidity of our stomach, which is much lower than an herbivore, and somewhere between an obligate carnivore and a pure scavenger, some pH of our stomach is between 1.5 and 2.
Yeah.
That argues that we're adapted to eating rotting meat. But the contaminants that generally end up in meat are things like E. coli, O157H7. These are like human contaminants. They're not in the meat.
Right.
They're like somebody's touching it, and it's,
I see.
These type of things. It's somebody like fecal, oral, transmit. Something is weird there.
Right.
They don't generally occur in the meat. There are parasites in animals in the wild, but I think that in healthy populations that have predators and they're not disrupted, that's less of a thing.
Yeah.
Though depending on the species you're looking at. Yeah.
When you were talking earlier about omnivores being specialized, and you were talking about dogs, for example, I was thinking one thing that I've run into in my research a lot is that people want an answer. They want a simple model that they can think of for evolution. And when you say, people evolved all over the world, people evolved in different environments, different social environments, different physical environments, that's unsatisfying for people because they want that simple answer. And I was thinking, any humans that were living in temperate environments would have been seasonally changing their diets as well, right? I mean, in the summer, you imagine they'd be eating more plants because there are more plants around. And in winter, it would be more of a meat-based diet. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find that the ideal human diet is one of constant change. I think one of the problems we have in our lives is that we've stabilized our environments, right? So we're not living seasonally. Wim Hof is all about getting cold. Well, why do we need to make ourselves cold? Well, because we're not living outside anymore, It's like, why do we need to have light dimmers on our computers? Because we're not living outside where the light gets dim at the end of the day, and we're looking at firelight. There is no blue light in a natural environment. So it's just interesting how we try to adapt ourselves to this artificially created natural environment, and yet one of the things we leave out of it is the variability. It's
a very important point. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off if you had more to say there.
No, I'm good. I wanted to ask you.
Can I comment on that?
Of course.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Don't go away yet.
No, I'm not going. I'm not going anywhere. We'll keep going. It's funny how at the beginning I said I don't want to talk about this carnivorous thing all day, but that's what we're talking about because it's fucking interesting. So
we can talk about whatever. Yeah, but I'm in Costa Rica, and it's a latitude that I really enjoy. It's a latitude of 9 north latitude. And so my story is that I ate a fully carnivorous diet of only meat and organs and fat and desiccated organ supplements for a year and a half. And then I ran into some issues with carbohydrates and thought, I'm getting a lot of muscle cramping, I'm getting heart palpitations. Maybe humans are not meant to be in ketosis for that long. Maybe ketosis is only meant to be a seasonal thing in people who live in northern latitudes, right? And so I reincorporated carbohydrates back in my diet from the sources that I feel are the least toxic, which are generally fruit. Like you said, this is what the plant wants you to eat, and honey, which we know hunter-gatherers eat around the world. There are all sorts of rabbit holes we can go down about fructose and sugars, but I've talked about that at length on my podcast as well, which is called Fundamental Health. But when I incorporated carbohydrates back in my diet, I felt much better. And so then I kind of trended myself toward what I've termed an animal-based diet. 70-80% of my diet is meat, organs, fat, and desiccated organ supplements, and 20% is now the least toxic plant foods. And being in Costa Rica, the papayas here are amazing. The mangoes here are amazing. And I'm in the sun a lot. I don't know if this is going to be video, but I'm really tan right now. And it's been really interesting. And so there is this idea that should we maybe eat based on where our ancestors were in terms of latitude? And the competing hypothesis, or the more the corollary hypothesis, is maybe we should be eating based on the latitude that we find ourselves in. Maybe just like our microbiome, our physiology is very malleable. And maybe me as a human, or my ancestors, were going to live in Texas, but going to migrate somewhere up in latitude, and their physiology had to be malleable. And so the latter hypothesis is quite compelling to me, that if you are living at the equator, maybe you'll be able to eat more fruit seasonally, or maybe you'll be able to eat more carbohydrates. And certainly it would make sense to eat fruit that grows here at the equator. I go to this grocery store here in Costa Rica, and they have things like strawberries and blueberries and raspberries, and it just looks absurd. It's like, what are you, because the people here, like the tourists, want to buy blueberries in Costa Rica, and I'm thinking, why the fuck would you do this? Like, you go across, there's a passion fruit and a mango and a guanabana and a guandillo, and there's all kinds of fruit that actually grows at this latitude, but people want their kale. They sell kale at this grocery store too, because there's way too much of a hippy dippy vibe here in these like yoga communities. But it's a great point, and I wonder, should we eat based on our latitude? So you in Colorado, it makes sense. Like maybe in your winter, you're going to have less carbohydrates and more meat. And then in your summer, you're going to maybe bring in fruit or other carbohydrates. And maybe it would even be fruit that grows there. But in the northern latitudes of the US, it's berries. When I was in Seattle for residency, it was raspberries and salmon berries and blackberries. That's what grows there. It makes sense. You're like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to eat in Seattle. But in Costa Rica, it's like, well, maybe I should eat papaya and mango because that's what's here. And this is the kind of stuff that's here year round. Maybe I can eat it year round. So I agree with you. I think there's variability, and it's probably or potentially based on the latitude that you find yourself at. Because my hypothesis, my suggestion would be that most humans have genetics that allow us to adapt. And if you suddenly find yourself in Alaska because your tribe migrated all the way up there, you're going to eat a lot of seal blubber and you're going to have less carbohydrates, especially in the winter months, and it's probably okay. People get all twisted thinking, I need to do my genetics. I'm from Italy, personally. I'm from Sicily and then German-Irish, but it's like, well, I'm a mutt, right? Like my mom is German-Irish, my dad's Sicilian. Like, how do I know which gene is the food gene? There is no food gene. It's not a monogenic thing. But it's an interesting question, yeah.
Well, and also, anytime we're talking about genetics, we need to talk about epigenetics and how, you can have a gene that never gets triggered or I forget the technical word for it, but we carry lots of genes that never engage. They never produce proteins or so you can have genes from Italy that aren't really relevant if you're living in Costa Rica because they never get turned on, Yeah. So okay, let's get back to the emotional concept here of this, the facet of this. I'm sure a lot of people resist this because of death, because they don't want to eat animals, because animals are cute and alive, and there's a tragic aspect to being carnivorous. How do you deal with that? Or is it a non-issue?
I think that those people need to do more psychedelics and talk to plants, and realize, realize that
someone said,
that life.
I'm sorry, we have a delay, so we keep interrupting each other. I'm sorry. Somebody said, you probably heard this anecdote. I think George Bernard Shaw was a famous vegetarian, and he said, I don't eat animals because I love animals. They're my friends. And so, I forget who, someone said to him, that's just because you're not sensitive enough to hear the tomato scream.
It's true. It's true, right? I mean, listen, plants are life. And there's a great book that I like. And this is a very Native American concept. And I'm not Native American, but I appreciate their spirituality and their cosmology. So there's a great book called The Tracker by Tom Brown Jr. I don't know if you're familiar with his works. He's an interesting guy he grew up in New Jersey, and it's about tracking animals. And he grew up in the Pine Barrens and had a friend who was Native American. And this friend's grandfather was sort of, one of the last living descendants of a traditionally thinking Native American population. I forget what tribe he was from, and I apologize for this, but people can read the book. It's really cool. So Tom Brown grew up with this life that I envied, which was like running around in the woods barefoot, tracking animals, learning how to be stealthy, like Indian, Native American martial arts and spirituality. And then when Tom Brown is 9 or 10 years old, he goes to kill his first animal. And he has a knife in his hand, and he's stalking a deer that's lame, like a baby deer that's lame. And he's thinking, okay, this is the animal that I'm going to kill. And he's in a tree, and he sees the path that the animal moves under this tree all the time, and he waits in this tree. And the baby deer walks under the tree, and he jumps out of the tree and stabs him with the knife, and he kills this lame baby deer, takes his life. And he walks back to camp with his baby deer, and he's sobbing. And this man, grandfather, who is his mentor, this Apache, I believe it was, says to him, "Why are you crying, Tom?" And he says, "Well, because I killed this animal." And I'm paraphrasing what grandfather says, but I hope the message will come through. I don't remember the exact passage. But what I took away from it was a sentiment like, when you understand that the life in the deer is the same as the life in a blade of grass, then you will understand that in order for something to live, something else must die. This is the way of life. And it's not a tragic thing. It's just what we do. That whether you're a bug that eats a smaller bug, or you're a shark that eats another fish, or you're a fish that eats an algae, there is something in the plant outside my window that gives it life force. It is anti-entropic. There is a life force in there. And if I go eat that plant or pull it up out of the ground, that's really a disrespect for life as a whole. We would not exist on the planet without plants. And there's like the George Washington and the cherry tree thing. Nobody's going to hand an axe to their 8-year-old and say, just go chop down the tree. There's a beautiful oak tree there. Why don't you just go chop it down? We don't care about the oak tree. Most humans, unless they're absolutely dead inside, would understand that an oak tree or a maple or a cherry tree is a beautiful plant, and it has a right to live, and there is some life force in there. So to create a hierarchy in our brain and say it's better to eat plants than animals is a very human thing. Like, who's to say the life force in a plant is any different than the life force in an animal? And people may say, oh, well, the animal feels pain. And to that you can reply, well, there are clearly chemical signals that plants emit when they feel pain. That, like, I've even heard this, like when you cut your grass, right? That smell is the grass like saying, we are in pain. You're hurting, you're chopping the grass. That's grass screaming, essentially. And I'm not telling people not to cut their lawn, but plants apparently, right? Plants, this guy's crazy. He doesn't want me to cut my lawn. Plants feel pain too. And I think that if we're going to be good humans, we'll understand that whether I'm getting a food from a plant or getting a food from an animal, I should be respectful and grateful for that. And it's kind of virtue signaling to say, I'm doing less harm to the planet by eating a plant. Because if you actually understand the way that plant was grown, a monocrop agriculture plant sprayed with pesticides that certainly gave those migrant workers some sort of pancreatic cancer and destroyed an ecosystem, and there's all the by-kills. Unless you're actually gathering foods, unless you're actually somebody that's going in the woods and picking herbs, you can't even begin to make that argument unless you understand where your food came from. And I'm going to argue that if we're getting food as modernized humans from a regenerative farm versus a monocrop farm of lettuce or kale, the one cow is much less suffering and much more vegan. I mean, people have even joked about this. Carnivore is the most vegan you can get. If we imagine that vegan is a framework of empathy. If you want to do the least harm, hunt an animal, spend time hunting, perfect your hunting skills, shoot the animal through the heart. You know, you'll cause pain for an instant and then it's over. These cows are killed with a bolt gun to the head. They don't suffer. They have one bad day in their whole life, which we all do, right? And when I die, my body will become food for worms. And I'm okay with that. And so I think that this is the type of argument that I think happens or comes from people who have not spent enough time in the wilderness and don't understand the way nature works. Yeah. I was recently speaking to a vegan physician in New York, and I think you and I talked about this on the podcast that we did on my show. And he said, I hate nature. It's just a big holocaust everywhere. And I thought, my God, dude, you need to spend more time in fucking nature and realize that's not what it is. It's a cycle, it's life and death. This is the freaking Lion King. It's the circle of life, man. In order for something to live, something else must die. And I would rather hunt it and kill it myself so that I remember it. And it is a reminder to me to be a good person, or at least get it from the best source that I can, than to get it from a grocery store. I mean, I do get most of my meat from a grocery store, but hunting is spiritual. Having a relationship with your food is spiritual, and no matter where we get our food from, we are causing death, and we need to act accordingly in our life. And I think that can be a beautiful reminder to us as humans to be a good damn human, to be kind, because you're lucky to be alive.
I agree with you. Yeah, it's strange. I'm not sure if I can relate these ideas, but I was talking with someone recently, and he said, we were talking about the hygiene hypothesis, and you were talking about autoimmune diseases earlier, and a lot of those diseases seem to have something to do with the absence of pathogens in our environments. Our microbiome suffers from the absence of dirt in our face when we're little kids. People who have animals running around in the house who also go outside have healthier immune systems than people who don't have any animals. So there seems to be a lot of evidence showing that people need pathogens. They need something to fight against so the immune system doesn't turn against its host, right, or itself. And I feel like there's something to that about emotional life as well. Like when we don't have external, like we've sanitized our emotional life to such an extent that we create totally unrealistic scenarios that provide the stress that we're missing from reality. You know what I mean? It's not a real clean picture I'm painting here, but when you were talking, I was thinking about what this other guy said. It's like when you kill an animal, yes, it's disruptive, it's bizarre, but it is spiritual if you do it properly, I think. And it does instill in us a humility and an acknowledgement that we are animals, and a reminder that we are mortal, right? As much as we don't want to believe that, it's a really important thing to know and to be reminded of on a regular basis. And what better way to remind yourself of that than to participate in the death of another animal rather than literally farming it out, right, to someone else to do the dirty work. It's interesting. I mean, I feel like a lot of, I wonder what you think about this as a physician, chronic pain disorders. Could chronic pain disorders be following this same mechanism? Could people who are suffering from fibromyalgia and chronic pain, they don't have enough pain in their lives, right? Like if they were falling down and scraping their knees or banging into walls or doing the stuff that hunter-gatherers do all the time, would they be less likely to be suffering from this possibly psychogenic pain?
Okay. That's a loaded question.
Yeah, sorry.
So
Sorry.
I do not believe, first and foremost, that chronic pain syndromes or fibromyalgia are psychogenic. I actually believe they're autoimmune. So I was nodding when you were saying that because I thought you were going to say, are they autoimmune? And I was thinking, yes. And then you went a different direction. I was like, oh, I don't know about that.
But did I? See, my point is that just like an autoimmune disorder is not caused by the environment, right? Psychogenic pain is pain. I'm not saying it's not pain. I'm not saying it's not real suffering. But the origin could be a faulty relationship between the environment and the individual.
Yes, the environment is such a broad term. When I think of the environment, I think of like the food that we're eating as well. But I definitely agree with you that we have overly sanitized our emotional lives. We've overly sanitized our physical lives. We wash our hands way too much, in my opinion. We use way too many soaps and deodorants and things with phthalates and xenoestrogens and chemicals, and we don't get exposed to dirt enough. We don't let our kids eat dirt. We don't skin our knees enough. We don't get exposed to pathogens. There's actually amazing stories of this. Somebody, I think it was one of my clients, sent me a story of this guy that lived in Russia, and I can't remember the details, but something happened with like communism. This guy and his family had lived in BFE, like the backwoods of Russia for 30 years. And some of them died and they were not healthy because they couldn't get enough food. But when they were contacted by Westerners, many of them got very sick because they had not been exposed to other Westerners. It was actually kind of a COVID type of conversation about the importance of being exposed to pathogens. They had not been exposed to any human other than their immediate family for 30 years. And they met other humans and they were suddenly overwhelmed, right? Their environment had become much too sanitized. It's kind of a cautionary tale regarding social distancing. Taken to the extreme, social distancing results in our death at an emotional level and at a physical level and an immunological level. And man, we haven't even talked about COVID on this podcast. But I agree with you. I think our lives have become too sanitary in all the ways. And as you were saying, fibromyalgia and chronic pain, I was excited to point out that I believe they're at least significantly related to autoimmune illness as well, neuroinflammatory. And I've seen them get a lot better when people make changes in their diet to align their diet more with what I would consider to be a species-appropriate diet: meat, organs, fat, least toxic plant foods. It's really cool to see it. But you're making an important point, and I'm kind of co-opting it.
No, that's what you're here for, man. We're here to co-op. Yeah, no, it's a very poorly articulated point I was trying to make. Just that I'd never thought about the hygiene hypothesis in terms of emotional life, and and how that could relate to chronic pain disorders. And I like the way you look at stress at the very beginning of the podcast when you were talking about going to Seattle and doing your residency and dealing with the asthma and the eczema. And you said, so what is it that I'm eating that's causing this? It struck me that your bias was toward diet and my bias is toward stress. I would always be, if I were your therapist or your buddy, I would say, what was going on in your life that was fucking you up? Medical school will fuck up anybody. So ironic that, people learning to be healers are subjected to one of the least healthy regimes known, 30-hour work schedule, 30-hour shifts. And, it's ridiculous. Incredible amounts of stress. And I would say what happened in your life around that time in terms of stress and meaning, that made you feel better. It sounds like you got a direction, which you've been going in for the last 3 or 4 years, that's been very good for you. You got a book out, you're well known, you're on TV, you're doing really well.
Stress is huge. You can't discount stress. And I think for me, it was some stress, but a lot of diet as well. But we know that acute stress, like I said, can cause cardiomyopathy. It can cause fenestrations in the gut. It can cause issues in the gut. And so stress cannot be discounted. And I think that one of the reasons I love living in Costa Rica right now is my life is less stressful. It's a slower pace of life. I get up in the morning, I surf, I watch the sunset every night. Basically, I want a podcast, and that's all I want to do right now. And so, and there's less hustle and bustle. I'm in a town with like a dirt road that goes through it. It's real easy. So yeah, there's a frenetic pace of life, and residency is crazy. But I don't recall at that point in my life having an acute stress event. It was more just like, I think that what I did was I did mega doses of these supposedly healthy mushrooms like reishi and chaga and lion's mane. And for whatever reason, those were a major insult to my immune system with lots of lectins or antigens. And the immune system went haywire and the eczema just exploded. That's the correlation that I can draw. But I think that those are if I had to pick two things, it would be dietary inputs and cognitive stress inputs that mess with us the most.
Yeah, I agree. Listen, man, thank you for your time. This is awesome. I didn't know you were living in Costa Rica. I thought you were just down there for a vacation.
Well, the vacation is becoming life. So
the best vacations tend to do that, don't they?
Yes, right? Yeah. So I think Mark Twain has the quote, like, the luckiest people in the world are the people that do all the time what everyone else does on their summer vacation or something like that. So I'm feeling pretty lucky. I'm certainly, I'm trying to live like we talked about in the last podcast, simply and I don't live extravagantly, but I like how easy it is to live here, how simple it is, how affordable it is, how I can walk around with no shoes and no shirt on dirt roads and go surf. And I'm quickly trying to understand how I can be here for most of the year. I don't think I'll live exclusively in Costa Rica, but I've been here since February. It's now the beginning of April, and I'm probably heading back to Austin at the end of May, but I'll quickly be coming back to Costa Rica, and I think maybe 6 to 8 months of the year here in the future. It's just a good place. You can get in the jungle. There's monkeys. I mean, you just hang out with monkeys and iguanas, and it's great.
Yeah, I think most Americans who haven't traveled internationally don't understand what they're missing. And, when you get out and you see like how other people live and how happy they are and how little they need to be happy, and you see how the media in this country is constantly cultivating this sense of panic, and it's just not necessary. And pura vida,
Yeah, man, it's true. I met a guy in Nosara who said he moved his family down here because he didn't want his kids to grow up amidst hysteria, and I thought that's really insightful. I don't have kids or a family, so I don't think I see it as acutely because I'm kind of insulated. Every time I see the hysteria, I think that's bullshit. Get the hell away from me.
Right.
I don't want to, this is all stupid. I've been talking about COVID and sort of reframing it on my podcast for over a year now. And it's not that I don't think COVID is a thing or that it's harming people, but just that I think the way we're thinking about it is a little bit warped. And I think there is a lot of hysteria around everything in the news cycle these days. That's how the news makes money. It's either, politician hysteria or, hysteria about international wars. And now they've got ultimate hysteria about this killer virus. And they've got this hope of a vaccine. So the whole thing is crazy, in my opinion. It's nice to be somewhere that's a little bit removed.